So we've talked about ways we viewed lichens or fungi as either kind of antagonists and as good guys, so to speak. And this idea of fungi kind of manipulating and working with other organisms has really, again, been captured in our popular psyche. One of the big video games out right now, one that I actually haven't played, is the Rest of Us, the Rest of Us series, where the world is plagued by these kind of zombies that are controlled by fungi. And this idea of fungi kind of working with and being in a symbiosis isn't just a fantasy. We have tons of organisms on Earth that have these kind of weird relationships with fungus. In no other way can we see this relationship working out as in lichens. And lichens are a very peculiar organism. In fact, in a lot of ways, they're not even an organism. They're more of a collection of it. And what they are is they're an extreme symbiotic relationship between a fungus and some kind of photosynthetic partners. And this relationship isn't always straightforward as you might think it is. And as we can see in these fungi relationships, that we have this kind of mix of different organisms going on. Mostly a lot of fungus, and then this kind of algal layer in these relationships. Within lichens, we talk a lot about the mycobiont. And if you kind of notice by the suffix myco, what we're getting at is the fungal partner in this symbiosis. Most of the time, these are controlled by Ascomycota, that big phylum of clump fungus. But sometimes we do occasionally see Basidiomycotas forming the mycobiont in these relationships. Within the lichen relationship, this mycobiont provides kind of the structure to the plant. So when you're looking at them, what you're mostly looking at is the fungal partner. They also can produce unique chemical compounds to also defend that plant, as well as allow them to do things like find a better foothold in the substrate that the lichen is growing in. They're also going to be the primary drivers of reproduction in these lichen relationships. A lot of times we see that the structure called a soiridia gets dispersed from the lichen. And what that is a complex kind of group of an algal cell, that photobiont partner, surrounded by hyphae. And that is able to get dispersed through passive methods and kind of grow and produce new lichen. The other partner in this relationship, we call it the photobiont. And this is what's going to be doing photosynthesis and producing sugar to kind of support the overall lichen structure. So both providing sugar both to the photobiont and the mycobiont in the lichen symbiosis. Within the photobionts are a lot more diverse than we see in the mycobionts. And the photobionts come from a lot of different lineages. We see green algae, so those kind of algae that are true plants. We see golden algae in it, as well as brown algae, so relatives of diatoms. And then we also see straight up cyanobacteria that form in these relationships. So the prokaryotic ancestors of what we think became chloroplasts. And cyanobacteria in particular is really interesting because a lot of times those cyanobacteria partners can not only provide photosynthetic materials, but they can provide nutrient fixation, such as breaking down nitrogen. In the lichen Peltigera genus, we see these cyanobacteria as being a primary driver of nitrogen uptake into a lot of ecosystems. Lichen taxonomy makes very little sense for a lot of the reasons why I talked about. Is not only are we talking about multiple different fungi and photosynthetic partners, but we're also talking about different taxa within those partners as well. And so really, there's a lot of questions and a lot of kind of philosophical ways we need to think about lichen going forward as we're starting to actually try to make phylogenies of these diverse organisms. However, though, we can morphologically break down lichen into three large groups. First, you have the crustose lichen, which are lichens that are very flat and straight and kind of live in intimate contact with the substrate they're going at. A lot of times we see these growing on rocks. We also have foliose lichen, which are more leafy lichens like this, that kind of look like a little leaf, or they kind of branch off and might have a little structure that kind of comes out 3D shapes. And then lastly, we have fruticose lichen. And these are the kind of the big bushy lichens, so things like the long strands of lichens you might see out in California in the coast region, or in high mountains with really good air quality, you see the usneas. These are kind of our big three-dimensional types of lichen. Lichens are really fascinating, not just because that they're this weird symbiotic relationship, but that they have also a lot of kind of interesting contacts with the greater world. Lichens are really sensitive to changes in air quality. And we start to see, as air quality change, they're one of the first organisms that tend to disappear from an area. In fact, this week's lab is really focused on exploring lichens and air qualities. Lichens also grow very slowly a lot of the times, and this slow growth has allowed the field of lichenometry to flourish, where we essentially can look at how long a surface has been exposed by how big a lichen might be. When I was an undergrad, I did a research project where I looked at historical Lake Superior lake levels and compared them to lichen growth, and I was able to find very strong correlations between how long an area had been without Lake Superior hitting it and the size of lichens along the lakeshore. Lichens also play important roles in primary succession too. Some of the enzymes that mycobiont produces is able to break down hard to break down materials like rocks and wood and whatnot. And then lastly, because lichens tend to grow in these kind of extreme environments a lot of times, lichens have been used by people historically for things such as dyes, as well as in food. In fact, the native people of Alaska have a traditional food where reindeer that have consumed lichen, they're able to, when they kill a reindeer, they actually will eat the gut contents of that reindeer, which is primarily with this reindeer lichen, and they'll mix it with things like fish eggs. And it might sound like a little kind of gross thing, but I can tell you it is a very actually delicious food. To go back to that symbiosis material, I think it's important to think about lichens is, are they actually a mutualistic relationship as we think about? So remember that this symbiosis is formed by a bunch of fungus and then a layer, an algal layer that provides kind of food sources for this symbiotic relationship. And this symbiotic relationship has been caught in our popular attention with this kind of fun rhyme. If you open up any lichen book, they're going to have this in it. And essentially it's Freddie was a fungus and Alice was an algae, and they took a lichen to each other with reference to that they are on rocks. But however, that relationship again was on the rocks. But if we look at this and think about this relationship between the fungi in there and the photobionts, and take a look at what makes up those partners, we see some interesting things emerge. So the photobionts, for instance, a lot of the photobionts we've isolated from lichens can exist as free living forms. We find them a lot in the woods and doing various different things. Although some photobionts we've only observed from these lichen symbiosis. And others yet are facultative. They're able to both exist within and without that lichen, and they can kind of switch back and forth even. But we do see that those photobionts, when they become part of the lichen symbiosis, they're very dramatically morphologically changed, and they're kind of shaped by that fungal partner into very certain areas and look certain ways in order to kind of meet the needs of that lichen symbiosis. On the other hand, when we look at the fungal part, which again are typically ascomycetes, with a few other from the other orders, we don't very much see these fungi living kind of independently outside of that lichen. So certain ascomycetes might be free living, but a lot of times that mycobiont, the species that makes up that, we haven't found out in the wild outside of these relationships. Furthermore, we do know that fungi are really good at recognizing particular photobionts in that. And again, they're going to use these structures called hosteria to essentially plug into that photobiont and keep it there. And with that hosteria, they're able to very closely chemically control what that photobiont is doing, telling it, okay, you need to reproduce, or you need to, kick up the photosynthesis, or kind of let it go a little bit. But we do see that being in this association allows that photobiont to kind of have greater habitat diversity than they would even if they were free living. And so a lot of people, because of this though, have kind of equated this into fungi discovering farming, so to speak. That fungi are able to tightly control these photobionts and get them to do what they need to do, much like how we grow a lot of our plants in agriculture. So I would recommend, when you're thinking about this fungi relationship, is forget about this idea with Freddy and fungus taking a liking to each other. But maybe think of it as Frida was a fungus and Al was an algae, and Frida kept Al tied up in her attic and drained a little blood from him every day, just to drink, have fun, but not enough to kill Al. But Al was probably too weak to run away and get out of this relationship. So a quick review is that lichens are this symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthetic partner. And remember, just because something's symbiosis doesn't mean it's mutually beneficial. Lichens have unique structures. They come in these crustose, fruticose, and foliose types. And that they're able to survive in a kind of a diverse variety of habitats. And so it's important to remember, is this a mutualistic relationship, or is this just fungal farming? And then also, on a last kind of personal note about lichens, is I will want to say that lichens have been a really important part of my life as a biologist. In fact, the first paper I was ever able to publish was a paper on lichens. And kind of when I was an undergrad, my lichen obsession got a little carried away. And so a lot of times, a lot of my friends, even to this day, will call me Miken as a reference to this period of my life. Okay.